The small town of Eldon Hollow was quiet that morning, wrapped in a thick blanket of gray clouds. The air felt heavy, as though the sky itself was grieving alongside the townsfolk gathered at the cemetery. It wasn't often that someone like Jonathan Grayson passed away, especially not so suddenly. He had been a kind man, always willing to lend a hand or share a smile, but his life had also been shrouded in mystery. People whispered about him behind closed doors, wondering why he spent so much time alone in his old barn late at night. No one truly understood what went on there, and now it seemed those secrets would die with him. As mourners filed into the cemetery, some clutching umbrellas while others simply let the drizzle dampen their clothes, the mood was somber. Children clung to their parents, unsure why everyone looked so sad. Friends exchanged soft words of comfort, recalling memories of Jonathan's generosity, how he'd fixed Mrs. Thompson's broken fence without asking for payment, or how he always made sure to bring fresh vegetables from his garden to neighbors who were struggling. Yet beneath the surface of these fond recollections lay unanswered questions. Why had Jonathan kept to himself so much? What had caused his sudden death? And why did the storm brewing overhead seem so unusually fierce? Jonathan's casket sat at the center of the gathering, its polished wood gleaming despite the gloomy weather. Flowers surrounded it, vibrant splashes of color against the bleak backdrop. The priest stood beside it, his voice steady as he began the service. His words flowed over the crowd, comforting yet distant, like rain tapping gently on a window pane. But even as he spoke, the wind picked up, rustling through the trees and sending leaves spiraling toward the ground. Thunder rumbled faintly in the distance, growing louder with each passing moment. People shifted uncomfortably, glancing nervously at the darkening sky. Lightning flashed briefly, illuminating the faces of those present. For a brief second, it seemed as though the entire world paused, holding its breath. Then, with a deafening crack that echoed across the cemetery, a bolt of lightning tore through the heavens and struck the coffin directly. The impact was instantaneous and chaotic. Sparks flew in every direction, and the force of the strike sent several mourners stumbling backward. Screams filled the air as panic set in. Some ran for cover, while others froze in place, too stunned to move. When the initial shock subsided, an eerie silence fell over the scene. Smoke curled lazily upward from the charred remains of the casket, mingling with the misty rain. Slowly, cautiously, people began to approach. Their eyes widened in disbelief as they peered inside. There, where Jonathan's body should have lain, there was nothing, not even ashes, just empty space, as if the lightning had somehow erased him entirely. Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by frantic whispers. What just happened? Where did he go? This can't be real. Detective Clara Hayes, who had attended the funeral out of respect for the Grayson family, stepped forward. Her sharp eyes scanned the scene, taking in every detail. Something about this didn't sit right with her. Lightning strikes were rare, enough but for one to hit with such precision, and then leave behind no trace of a body? It defied logic. She knelt beside the coffin, examining the scorched wood and singed lining. Whatever had occurred here, it wasn't natural. Clara turned to the crowd, her voice cutting through the murmurs. Does anyone know if Jonathan had any unusual habits? Anything that might explain this? At first, no one responded. Then, hesitantly, an elderly man named Mr. Peterson raised his hand. He used to spend hours out in his barn, he said, his voice trembling. We all thought he was tinkering with tools or working on projects, but he trailed off, glancing around as if afraid to speak further. But what? Clara prompted, leaning closer. Well, Mr. Peterson continued, lowering his voice. Some folks claimed they saw strange lights coming from the barn at night, bright flashes like electricity surging. And once, I swear I heard him talking to himself, or maybe to something else. Like he was arguing with it. Clara's brow furrowed. Electricity? That could explain the lightning strike, but it still didn't account for Jonathan's disappearance. Determined to get to the bottom of things, she decided to visit his property later that day. As the mourners dispersed, many muttering prayers under their breath, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger mystery. Back at the station, Clara reviewed what little information she had. Jonathan Grayson had lived alone, kept mostly to himself, and rarely interacted with others outside of helping them with odd jobs. Neighbors described him as polite but distant, almost secretive. There were rumors, of course. Small towns always had rumors, but most dismissed them as idle gossip. Still, Clara couldn't ignore the possibility that Jonathan had been involved in something dangerous, something that might have cost him his life, or perhaps transformed it into something unrecognizable. As evening approached, the storm showed no signs of letting up. Rain lashed against windows and thunder rolled continuously, as if nature itself was restless. Clara grabbed her coat and headed out, determined to uncover the truth. Little did she know, what awaited her at Jonathan's home would challenge everything she thought she knew about life, death, and the forces that governed them. The rain continued to pour as Detective Clara Hayes pulled her car into the driveway of Jonathan Grayson's modest home. The house stood at the edge of Eldon Hollow, surrounded by overgrown grass and gnarled trees that swayed ominously in the stormy wind. It was a lonely place, isolated from the rest of the town, and Clara couldn't help but feel a chill run down her spine as she stepped out of the vehicle. The air smelled of damp earth and electricity, a strange combination that made her senses tingle. She tightened her grip on her flashlight and moved toward the front door. The house looked untouched since Jonathan's death, its windows dark and unwelcoming. Clara knocked once, more out of habit than expectation, before letting herself in. Inside, the air was thick with dust and silence. The furniture was simple: a worn couch, a wooden table, a few chairs, but everything seemed frozen in time, as if waiting for its owner to return. Clara began her search methodically, checking each room for clues. In the kitchen, she found stacks of old newspapers, their headlines yellowed with age. On the dining table lay an unfinished crossword puzzle, the pen still resting where it had been left days ago. But it wasn't until she entered the barn that things took a turn. The structure loomed behind the house, its weathered wooden walls creaking under the weight of the storm. Clara hesitated for a moment, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness as she pushed open the heavy door. The smell of oil and burnt metal hit her immediately, sharp and metallic. Her light revealed tools scattered across workbenches, wires hanging like spiderwebs from the ceiling, and strange machines that looked like they belonged in a science fiction movie rather than a rural barn. In the center of the space, partially hidden beneath a tarp, was a large device that seemed to pulse faintly, even in the dim light. Clara's heart raced as she approached it, her curiosity outweighing her caution. Pulling back the tarp, she gasped. The machine was unlike anything she'd ever seen. Tall, intricate, and covered in dials, switches, and glowing tubes. It hummed, softly, almost imperceptibly, as though alive. Nearby, she spotted a stack of journals, their covers stained with grease and dirt. Flipping through them, Clara realized they belonged to Jonathan. The entries were detailed and obsessive, documenting years of experiments and theories. Jonathan had been fascinated by electricity, not just as a source of power, but as something far deeper, something almost spiritual. He wrote about harnessing electromagnetic energy to transcend human limitations, to rewrite the rules of life and death. Some pages were filled with sketches of circuits and equations, while others contained philosophical musings. One passage caught Clara's attention. What if we are all connected by invisible threads of energy? What if death is merely a barrier we can break through with enough understanding? I believe I am close to unlocking the key. But there are risks, forces I cannot yet comprehend. Clara's mind raced as she read. Was this why Jonathan had disappeared? Had his experiments gone too far? She flipped to the final entry, dated just days before his death. His handwriting was hurried, almost frantic. Tonight, I will attempt the ultimate test. If successful, I will no longer be bound by flesh and bone. I will become energy itself, free to roam the currents of the universe. If I fail, well, Perhaps it is better not to think of failure. Her hands trembled as she closed the journal. This wasn't just madness scribbled in isolation. It was the work of a man consumed by his vision, willing to risk everything to achieve it. But what had happened after he conducted his experiment? Had the lightning strike at the funeral been part of his plan, or had it been an accident? As Clara explored further, she noticed something odd about the barn's floor. Certain sections seemed newer than others, as if they had been replaced recently. Dropping to her knees, she ran her fingers along the edges of one patch, feeling a slight gap. With some effort, she managed to pry it loose, revealing a hidden staircase leading downward. Her pulse quickened. Whatever secrets Jonathan had kept, they were buried deep, literally. Descending cautiously, Clara found herself in a small underground laboratory. The space was cramped but meticulously organized, lined with shelves holding jars of chemicals, coils of wire, and notebooks similar to the ones upstairs. At the center of the room was another machine, smaller but equally complex, connected to a series of electrodes and panels. A chair sat nearby, its leather seat cracked and worn as if someone had spent countless hours sitting there. On one of the tables, Clara discovered a series of photographs. They showed Jonathan working on his inventions, his face illuminated by arcs of electricity. In some, he appeared exhausted, his eyes sunken and haunted. In others, he looked exhilarated, as if he had glimpsed something extraordinary. But one photo stood out, a blurry image of what appeared to be a figure standing in the midst of a swirling vortex of light. The figure was indistinct, almost ghostly, but Clara could make out the outline of a man. Could this have been Jonathan? During one of his experiments? Suddenly, the lights flickered above her head. Clara froze, her flashlight beam sweeping across the room. For a moment, she thought she heard a faint buzzing sound, like static electricity crackling in the air. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the noise stopped. Shaking off her unease, she turned her attention back to the machines. One of them bore a label scrawled in Jonathan's handwriting, Project Ascension. Clara's stomach churned. She didn't know whether to admire Jonathan's brilliance or fear the consequences of his ambition. As she gathered the journals and photos to take with her, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every shadow seemed to shift slightly. Every creak of the floorboards echoed louder than it should have. Yet when she spun around, there was nothing there. Only the oppressive weight of the storm outside, and the lingering sense that Jonathan's presence still lingered in this place. By the time Clara climbed back up the stairs and emerged into the night, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. She paused for a moment, staring at the dark silhouette of the barn. Something told her that Jonathan's story wasn't over, that the lightning strike at the funeral had triggered something far beyond anyone's comprehension. And as she drove away from the property, the pieces of the puzzle swirling in her mind, she knew one thing for certain. Whatever Jonathan had become, it was still out there, watching, waiting, and perhaps even plotting its next move. The next morning, Detective Clara Hayes sat at her desk in the station, surrounded by Jonathan Grayson's journals and photographs. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a pale, washed-out sky that did little to lift her spirits. Her mind was racing, trying to piece together the fragments of a puzzle that seemed to grow more complicated with each passing hour. Jonathan's notes were filled with cryptic references to energy, transformation, and transcendence, but they offered no clear answers. What had he been attempting in that underground lab? And what had happened after the lightning struck his coffin? As she flipped through the pages, one phrase kept jumping out at her. Becoming one with the grid. It appeared repeatedly, always accompanied by sketches of intricate circuits and diagrams of power lines. Clara didn't fully understand it, but the words sent a shiver down her spine. Becoming one with the grid. It sounded like something out of a science fiction novel, not the writings of a man who lived in a quiet farming town. Yet there was an undeniable seriousness to Jonathan's tone, as if he truly believed he could achieve such a feat. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Without waiting for an invitation, Officer Mike Reynolds stepped inside, holding a steaming cup of coffee. "You've been holed up here all night," he said, setting the cup down beside her. "Thought you might need this." Clara gave him a weak smile. "Thanks, Mike. I didn't realize how late it got." Mike glanced at the scattered papers on her desk. "Still digging into Grayson's case?" When she nodded, he leaned against the doorway, crossing his arms. "People are starting to talk, you know. They think it's weird that you're spending so much time on this. Some are even saying—" He hesitated, looking uncomfortable. "Saying what?" Clara prompted, raising an eyebrow. "That maybe you're chasing ghosts," Mike admitted. "Or worse, that you're wasting time on something that can't be," explained. Clara sighed, rubbing her temples. She knew he wasn't wrong. To most people, Jonathan's disappearance was just another strange event in a world full of mysteries. But she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it, that something tangible, something dangerous was lurking beneath the surface. "I'm not ready to let this go yet," she said firmly. "Not until I have answers." Mike shrugged. "Just be careful, okay? This town has seen its share of oddities, but this feels different." After he left, Clara returned to the journals, determined to find a clue that would lead her closer to the truth. As she skimmed through the entries, one detail caught her: a map tucked between the pages. Unfolding it, she realized it depicted Eldon Hollow and its surrounding areas, with certain locations marked in red ink. Among them was the old power plant on the outskirts of town, long abandoned after a fire decades ago. Written in the margin was a single word: convergence. The discovery sent a jolt of excitement through her. Could this be where Jonathan had conducted his final experiment? If his goal had been to merge with some kind of energy source, the power plant made sense. It was the perfect location to tap into raw electrical currents. Grabbing her coat, Clara decided to investigate immediately. The drive to the power plant took her past fields and forests, the landscape growing increasingly desolate the farther she went. By the time she arrived, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the crumbling structure. Vines snaked up the walls, and broken windows stared out like hollow eyes. Clara parked her car and approached cautiously, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of rusted metal. The machinery was silent now, its gears frozen in place, but Clara could almost imagine the roar of turbines and the crackle of electricity that once filled the space. She moved deeper into the building, following the map's markings. Eventually, she reached a large chamber dominated by a massive control panel covered in switches, levers, and gauges. In the center of the room stood a towering device connected to countless wires, its purpose unclear but undeniably ominous. As Clara examined the setup, she noticed something unusual: fresh scorch marks on the floor, as if someone had recently used the equipment. Her heart skipped a beat. Whoever or whatever had caused those marks might still be nearby. She called out tentatively, her voice echoing in the vast emptiness. "Hello? Is anyone here?" For a moment, there was only silence. Then, from the shadows, came a faint It started low, almost imperceptible, but quickly grew louder, vibrating through the floor beneath her feet. Clara spun around, her flashlight beam darting wildly. That's when she saw it: a figure standing at the edge of the room, partially obscured by the dim light. At first, she thought it was a trick of her imagination, but as the figure stepped forward, her breath caught in her throat. It was Jonathan Grayson, or at least it looked like him. His features were familiar, but there was something profoundly wrong about him. His skin shimmered faintly, as though lit from within, and his eyes glowed with an unnatural light. He didn't walk so much as glide, his movements fluid and otherworldly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Clara's mind raced, trying to reconcile what she was seeing with everything she thought she knew about life and death. Finally, Jonathan broke the silence. His voice was soft but carried an unsettling resonance, as if multiple tones were layered together. "Detective Hayes," he said, tilting his head slightly. "I wondered if you'd come." Clara swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. "Jonathan, is that really you?" He smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his glowing eyes. In a way, I suppose you could say I've evolved. The lightning strike completed the process I began in my lab. Now I am no longer bound by the limitations of flesh and bone. I exist as energy, flowing freely through the currents of the world. Clara took a step back, her mind struggling to process his words. What does that mean? Are you alive? Dead? Something else entirely? Jonathan's expression softened, almost wistful. It's difficult to explain. Imagine being untethered from everything that once defined you, your body, your mortality. You become pure potential, capable of experiencing existence in ways you never dreamed possible. It's liberating. Despite his calm demeanor, Clara sensed a tension beneath his words, a hint of instability. But why? She asked. Why risk everything for this? Don't you miss being human? His smile faltered, replaced by a look of quiet sadness. At first, yes. There were moments when I doubted myself, when the loneliness threatened to overwhelm me. But now, he paused, gesturing vaguely toward the machines around them. Now I see the bigger picture. Humanity is limited, confined by its biology. But energy? Energy is eternal. It flows through everything, the stars, the earth, even you. By becoming part of it, I've transcended those limits. Clara shook her head, overwhelmed by the implications. And the lightning strike? Was that part of your plan? Jonathan nodded slowly. In a way, I designed the experiment to harness the storm's power, but I couldn't predict exactly how it would manifest. The lightning acted as a catalyst, completing the transformation I had initiated. It consumed my physical form, leaving only this essence. As he spoke, Clara noticed something alarming. The lights overhead began to flicker again, brighter this time, and the hum in the air grew louder. Sparks danced along the wires connecting the central device, crackling with increasing intensity. Whatever Jonathan had become, he seemed to be influencing the environment around him and not entirely under his control. Jonathan, she said urgently, taking another step back. You need to stop this. You're destabilizing the system. You don't know what you're doing. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed his glowing face. I know what I'm doing, he insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. This is my destiny, my purpose. No, Clara snapped, surprising even herself with her vehemence. Your purpose was to help people, remember? To fix fences and bring vegetables to your neighbors, not to play God with forces you can't understand. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Jonathan stared at her, his shimmering form wavering slightly as if her argument had struck a nerve. The room fell silent except for the persistent buzzing of electricity. Then, without warning, the lights surged violently, bathing the chamber in blinding brilliance. Clara shielded her eyes, bracing herself for what might come next. When the glare faded, Jonathan was gone, or rather, he had dissolved into the very air itself, his presence lingering as a faint warmth on her skin. The machinery powered down, its hum fading into silence. Clara stood there for a long moment, her heart pounding, unsure whether she should feel relieved or terrified. She didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain. Jonathan. Grayson's story was far from over, and as she walked back to her car, the weight of that realization settled heavily on her shoulders. The days following Clara's encounter with Jonathan Grayson, or whatever he had become, were unlike anything the town of Eldon Hollow had ever experienced. At first, it seemed as though life might return to normal. The storm that had raged during Jonathan's funeral had finally cleared, leaving behind crisp autumn air and golden sunlight filtering through the trees. But beneath this calm exterior, strange occurrences began to ripple through the town, unsettling its residents. Started subtly. Lights in homes flickered erratically, even when there was no wind or bad weather to blame. Appliances acted up. Refrigerators stopped working for hours at a time, only to restart without explanation. Radios tuned themselves to static-filled frequencies late at night, their dials spinning on their own. Some people dismissed these incidents as coincidences or glitches, but others weren't so sure. Whispers spread among neighbors. Something isn't right. Then came the sightings. Late one evening, Mrs. Thompson, who lived just down the road from Jonathan's old house, swore she saw him standing at the edge of her garden. She described him exactly as Clara had seen him, his skin glowing faintly, his movements unnaturally smooth. When she called out to him, he didn't respond. Instead, he raised a hand as if in greeting before vanishing into thin air. Terrified, she locked herself inside and refused to leave her home for days. Others reported similar encounters. A farmer claimed he'd spotted Jonathan near his barn, inspecting tools that hadn't been touched in years. A young boy told his parents he'd seen him walking along the railroad tracks, his silhouette shimmering like heat waves rising off asphalt. Each account added another layer of mystery to the growing legend of Jonathan Grayson, the man who had somehow cheated death and returned to something otherworldly. Clara listened to these stories with a mix of fascination and dread. She visited several witnesses, piecing together their accounts while trying to keep her emotions in check. What struck her most was how consistent the descriptions were. Everyone agreed. Jonathan wasn't entirely human anymore. His presence felt both familiar and alien, comforting yet deeply unsettling. Many said he spoke to them, not with words, but through sensations. A warm tingling in their chest, a sudden clarity of thought, or a fleeting memory of happier times. Others described hearing faint whispers like voices carried on the wind, urging them to listen or remember. One witness stood out, a reclusive handyman named Harold Jenkins, who rarely interacted with anyone in town. When Clara knocked on his door, he greeted her warily, his face lined with exhaustion. After some coaxing, he admitted he'd encountered Jonathan outside the abandoned power plant 2 nights earlier. Unlike the others, Harold claimed Jonathan had communicated directly with him. "He said he's trying to help us," Harold explained, his voice trembling. "He kept talking about the grid and how we're all connected. He said he can feel everything now. The electricity running through wires, the energy in living things. It's like he's part of it all." Clara leaned forward, her pen poised over her notebook. "Did he say what he wants?" Harold hesitated, rubbing his temples as if trying to recall every detail. "He said he's learning, that he's still figuring out what it means to be whatever he is now. But he also said something weird. He mentioned ascending, like there's another step he needs to take." Ascension. The word sent a chill through Clara. She remembered reading it in Jonathan's journals, always accompanied by cryptic notes about breaking free from mortal constraints. If Harold was telling the truth, and Clara had no reason to doubt him, it meant Jonathan's transformation wasn't complete. Whatever state he existed in now, it was temporary. He was still evolving. As the days passed, the disturbances grew, more pronounced. Power outages became frequent, plunging entire neighborhoods into darkness. Static electricity crackled constantly, making hair stand on end and causing small shocks whenever people touched metal surfaces. Even the animals seemed affected. Dogs barked incessantly at empty spaces, and birds gathered in massive flocks, circling overhead as if sensing an approaching storm. The townsfolk grew increasingly uneasy. Some turned to religion, holding prayer meetings in hopes of banishing whatever force had invaded their lives. Others demanded answers from the authorities, accusing Clara of withholding information. She tried to reassure them, explaining that she was doing everything she could to understand what was happening, but her words did little to ease their fears. Rumors swirled that Jonathan had cursed the town, that his experiments had unleashed something beyond human comprehension. Amidst the chaos, Clara found herself drawn back to Jonathan's property. She couldn't shake the feeling that the answers lay hidden there, buried beneath layers of secrecy and science. Returning to the barn, she descended once again into the underground lab. This time she brought tools, a voltage meter, a multimeter, anything she thought might help her analyze the machines Jonathan had built. As she worked, she noticed something new. faint traces of electromagnetic activity emanating from the equipment. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. Her investigation led her to a discovery she hadn't anticipated. Hidden behind a false panel in the wall was a series of recordings, audio files stored on an old cassette player. Curious, Clara pressed play. Jonathan's voice filled the room, calm and measured, recounting details of his experiments. In one recording, he described the moment he realized he could manipulate electrical currents, not just generate them. Energy responds to intention, he said. Focus your mind and you can shape it, direct it. I've begun testing this theory on myself, using low-level currents to stimulate my nervous system. The results are promising. In another recording, his tone shifted, becoming darker and more urgent. I'm losing control, he admitted. The energy is unpredictable, volatile. Sometimes I wonder if I've created something I can't contain, but I can't stop now, not when I'm so close. By the time Clara finished listening to the tapes, her head was spinning. Jonathan's experiments had clearly pushed him beyond the boundaries of conventional science, blurring the line between genius and madness. Yet there was a tragic undertone to his story. A man driven by curiosity and ambition, only to find himself trapped in a reality he barely understood. That night, as Clara drove home, she couldn't escape the sense that Jonathan was watching her. Every shadow seemed to move slightly. Every gust of wind carried a whisper. When she arrived at her house, she double-checked the locks and drew the curtains, unable to shake the feeling of being followed. As she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she replayed Harold's words in her mind. He said he's still learning, still ascending. What did that mean? And what would happen when Jonathan reached the next stage of his transformation? Clara feared the answer, but deep down, she knew she couldn't walk away. Whatever fate awaited Jonathan, and perhaps the entire town, she was determined to see it through. The next morning, Detective Clara Hayes woke with a heaviness in her chest. Sleep had been elusive the previous night, her mind replaying fragments of Jonathan's recordings and Harold's cryptic warnings. Ascension. The word echoed in her, thoughts like a distant drumbeat, ominous and relentless. She knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. Jonathan's transformation wasn't just about him anymore. Whatever he was becoming, it was affecting the entire town. And if she didn't act soon, things could spiral out of control. Clara decided to revisit the abandoned power plant. It was the epicenter of everything, the place where Jonathan had conducted his final experiment, where she'd encountered him as an energy-based entity. If there were answers to be found, they would be there. Armed with her tools, a flashlight, and a growing sense of unease, she drove back to the desolate structure on the outskirts of Eldon Hollow. When she arrived, the air felt different, charged, almost electric. The hairs on her arms stood on end as she approached the entrance. Inside, the hum of latent energy greeted her once again, louder this time, pulsing through the walls like a heartbeat. Clara moved cautiously, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. As she reached the central chamber, she noticed something new. The massive device at the heart of the room was active. Faint arcs of electricity crackled between its nodes, casting eerie shadows across the floor. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized what was happening. Jonathan wasn't just present here. He was influencing the machine, feeding off its power. And he wasn't alone. Surrounding the device were faint outlines, shimmering forms that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. They weren't fully materialized, but their presence was undeniable. Were these remnants of other energies? Or had Jonathan somehow created duplicates of himself? Before Clara could process what she was seeing, the lights surged violently, bathing the room in blinding brilliance. When the glare faded, Jonathan stood before her, his glowing form more defined than ever. His eyes, brighter now, locked onto hers with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "Detective Hayes," he said, his voice layered with harmonics that resonated in her bones. "You've returned." Clara steadied herself, gripping her flashlight tightly. "Jonathan, you need to stop this. You're destabilizing the grid, not just here but everywhere. People are scared, things are breaking down, this isn't helping anyone." For a moment, Jonathan looked conflicted. His shimmering figure wavered, as though struggling to maintain cohesion. "I don't mean to cause harm," he replied softly, "but I can't turn back now. The energy, it calls to me. It shows me possibilities beyond comprehension. I see connections everywhere, in the wires, in the stars, even in the people around me. Humanity is so limited, Clara, so fragile. But I've transcended those limits, don't you see? I'm free." Clara shook her head, frustration bubbling to the surface. "Free? Is that what you call this? You're tearing apart the fabric of reality. Your experiments have consequences and you're not considering them. Look at what's happening to Eldon Hollow, to the people who trusted you." Jonathan tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "Trust? They never understood me. None of them did. Not even you." He paused, his glow intensifying. "But perhaps you're right. Perhaps I haven't fully grasped the scope of my abilities. That's why I must ascend further. Only then will I understand how to wield this power responsibly." Clara's heart sank. Ascension. It all came back to that. "What does that mean, Jonathan? What happens when you ascend?" He hesitated, his luminous eyes clouding with uncertainty. "I don't know for sure, but I feel it pulling me. A higher state, a greater integration with the grid. I'll become something more. Something eternal." Clara took a step closer, her voice firm despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "And what about the rest of us? Will we survive your ascension? Or will you consume everything, including yourself?" Jonathan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the device, his form flickering erratically. Sparks danced along the wires, and the hum grew deafening. Clara realized with mounting dread that the machine was amplifying his energy, drawing power from the surrounding environment. If she didn't intervene, the entire system might overload and take the town with it. "You're losing control," she said urgently, raising her voice over the noise. "This isn't freedom, Jonathan, it's chaos. You're not ascending. You're unraveling. Do you really want to destroy everything you once cared about?" His face softened, a trace of the old Jonathan emerging beneath the radiant facade. "I never wanted to hurt anyone," he murmured. "But I can't stop now. The pull is too strong. Even if I wanted to, I don't think I could." Clara's mind raced. There had to be a way to shut the machine down, to sever Jonathan's connection to the grid before it was too late. Scanning the control panel, she spotted a large red switch labeled Emergency Shutdown. It was risky. Cutting the power abruptly might destabilize the system further, but it was the only option she had. "I'm sorry, Jonathan," she whispered, steeling herself for what she had to do. With one swift motion, she flipped the switch. The reaction was instantaneous. The machine let out a deafening roar as the flow of energy reversed, sucking the electricity back into its core. Jonathan screamed, a sound both human and unearthly, as his form began to dissolve. The shimmering outlines around him collapsed, merging into the vortex of light and static that enveloped the room. Clara shielded her eyes as the brightness intensified, threatening to overwhelm her senses. When the surge finally subsided, the chamber fell silent. The machine lay dormant, its circuits smoking faintly. Clara lowered her arm, her vision swimming, as she adjusted to the sudden darkness. Jonathan was gone, or rather he had dispersed completely, leaving no trace behind. Breathing heavily, Clara sank to her knees, tears streaming down her face. She hadn't wanted to kill him, not again, but she'd had no choice. The alternative would have been far worse. As she sat there, surrounded by the wreckage of Jonathan's ambition, she couldn't help but wonder if he'd found peace in the end. Had he truly ascended, or had he simply vanished into the void? The walk back to her car felt surreal, as though she were moving through a dream. Eldon Hollow remained eerily quiet, the storm of energy having passed. For now, life seemed to return to normal. Lights stopped flickering, appliances resumed functioning, and the townsfolk breathed a collective sigh of relief. But Clara knew better. Jonathan's legacy lingered, woven into the very essence of the town. She could still feel it sometimes, a faint hum in the air, a spark of static against her skin. Whether it was merely residual energy or something more, she couldn't say. All she knew was that Jonathan Grayson's story wasn't over. It was simply waiting for its next chapter. In the weeks that followed Jonathan Grayson's second disappearance, or perhaps his final departure, life in Eldon Hollow slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. The strange occurrences that had plagued the town began to fade. Lights no longer flickered without reason. Appliances worked as they were supposed to, and the pervasive static electricity dissipated. The townsfolk, though still shaken, started to breathe easier. Many chalked up the bizarre events to mass hysteria or some unexplained natural phenomenon, eager to move on from the unsettling chapter in their lives. For Detective Clara Hayes, however, moving on wasn't so easy. She carried the weight of what she'd witnessed and what she'd done like an invisible burden. Every time she passed by Jonathan's old house or drove near the abandoned power plant, memories flooded back. The glow of his transformed form, the hum of energy coursing through the air, the moment she flipped the switch and erased him completely. It was a decision she replayed in her mind countless times, questioning whether it had been necessary, whether there might have been another way. But deep down, she knew she'd made the right choice. If she hadn't acted, the consequences could have been catastrophic, not just for Eldon Hollow, but potentially for something much larger. Still, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that Jonathan's presence lingered. There were moments when she swore she felt a faint warmth against her skin, like sunlight breaking through clouds, or heard a whisper in the wind that sounded eerily familiar. At night, lying awake in bed, she would stare at the ceiling and wonder if he was truly gone, or if he existed now in some form beyond human comprehension. Was he part of the electrical grid flowing silently through wires and transformers? Or had he merged with something even greater, becoming one with the universe itself? Her curiosity eventually led her back to Jonathan's journals and recordings. She spent hours poring over them, searching for answers to questions she couldn't quite articulate. In one of the tapes, Jonathan spoke about the interconnectedness of all things, describing how energy flowed not just through machines but through living beings, nature, and even emotions. "We're all connected," he said, his voice tinged with awe. "Every thought, every action, it ripples outward, shaping the world around us." Clara found herself reflecting on those words long after the tape ended. If Jonathan had indeed become pure energy, then perhaps his essence was still woven into the fabric of existence, influencing the world in ways too subtle to detect. Maybe that was why she felt his presence occasionally, a reminder that he hadn't vanished entirely but had simply transformed into something intangible, yet enduring. As winter approached, bringing with it frosty mornings and crisp, clear skies, Clara noticed changes within herself. She became more attuned to the small details of everyday life. The way sunlight danced on water, the sound of leaves rustling in the breeze, the warmth of a stranger's smile. It was as if Jonathan's obsession with energy and connection had seeped into her subconscious, making her see the world differently. She began to appreciate the delicate balance of forces that held everything together, from the smallest atom to the vast expanse of the cosmos. One evening, as she sat by the window watching snowflakes drift lazily to the ground, Clara received an unexpected visitor. It was Harold Jenkins, the reclusive handyman who had claimed to encounter Jonathan outside the power plant. He hesitated on her doorstep, clutching a worn leather satchel before finally speaking. "I brought you something," he said gruffly, handing her the bag. Inside, she found a collection of sketches and notes, his own observations of the strange phenomena that had gripped the town. Some were technical diagrams reminiscent of Jonathan's work, while others were abstract drawings of swirling light and geometric patterns. One page caught her eye, a depiction of a figure radiating energy, standing at the center of a web-like network that stretched infinitely outward. "This is incredible," Clara murmured, flipping through the pages. "Did you come up with this yourself?" Harold shrugged, looking uncomfortable under her gaze. "I don't know where it came from, ever since I saw him. That night at the power plant, I've been seeing things, patterns, connections, like he showed me something I wasn't meant to understand. Clara studied the drawings closely, realizing they mirrored many of the concepts Jonathan had described in his journals. Whether Harold had unknowingly tapped into Jonathan's energy or simply channeled his ideas through intuition, it was impossible to say. But one thing was clear: Jonathan's influence extended far beyond his physical form. "Thank you for sharing this," Clara said sincerely. "It helps make sense of things." Harold nodded stiffly, then turned to leave. Before stepping off the porch, he glanced back at her. "You did what you had to do," he said quietly. "Don't let it weigh on you forever." His words stayed with her long after he disappeared into the snowy night. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that she hadn't destroyed Jonathan but rather set him free. Perhaps his transformation had been inevitable, a culmination of years spent chasing an impossible dream. And maybe, in some way, she had played a role in helping him reach his ultimate goal. Spring arrived gradually, melting away the remnants of winter and ushering in a season of renewal. The town of Eldon Hollow thrived once again, its residents going about their daily lives with renewed vigor. Children played in the streets, farmers tended to their fields, and laughter echoed through the air. Yet beneath the surface of this idyllic scene, traces of Jonathan's legacy remained. Occasionally, someone would report seeing flashes of light in the distance or hearing faint whispers carried on the breeze. These accounts were dismissed as figments of imagination or tricks of the mind, but Clara knew better. She suspected that Jonathan's energy still flowed through the town, manifesting in fleeting glimpses and gentle reminders of his presence. It was as if he had become part of the collective consciousness, a guardian spirit watching over the place he had once called home. On a quiet afternoon, Clara visited Jonathan's property one last time. The barn stood silent, its secrets buried beneath layers of dust and shadow. She wandered through the rooms of his house, taking in the remnants of his life: the unfinished crossword puzzle on the dining table, the tools neatly arranged on shelves, the photographs of smiling faces frozen in time. Despite the sadness that clung to the space, she felt a sense of peace. Jonathan had been a man driven by curiosity and ambition, traits that defined both his brilliance and his downfall. In the end, he had sought something greater than himself, and in doing so, he had left behind a story that would never be forgotten. As she locked the door behind her and walked back to her car, Clara paused to look at the horizon. The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden rays across the landscape. Somewhere, deep within the currents of energy that flowed through the earth and sky, she believed Jonathan was still out there, alive in his own way, eternal and untethered. And though she would never fully understand what he had become, she took comfort in knowing that his journey had touched the lives of everyone he'd left behind. The road ahead stretched endlessly before her, lined with possibilities and uncertainties. But as Clara drove away from Jonathan's house, she felt a spark of hope, a quiet certainty that even in the face of mystery and loss, life continued to unfold in beautiful, unpredictable ways. Whatever lay beyond the horizon, she was ready to face it, with open eyes, an open heart, and the memory of a man who dared to dream of infinity.